It's Wednesday, February 19th, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Granthermes. Today in the show, as Elon Musk moves through agencies and departments, virtually unchecked, we're starting to see the fallout from the mass firings across the U.S. government and their effects in the country at large. So it has been a week of firings across the federal government, starting on Valentine's Day last week, which I and a lot of other journalists are calling the Valentine's Day massacre in the federal government, and then through the weekend, and then all the way up until today. We are talking hundreds or thousands of people from individual departments apiece, 2,400 from the Forestry Service, and we're just getting over the devastating effects of the wildfires in Los Angeles, and we are expected to have more wildfires along the West Coast and Pacific Northwest again this year. 2,300 from the Department of the Interior that manages Native American reservations, oil and mineral mining contracts, and the national parks. 200 to 300 firings from the FAA. We don't have official numbers on those yet, but they were people who worked in radar systems and some who were working on cruise missile defense alongside the DoD in Hawaii, not to mention we are not even a full month away from the deadliest plane crash on U.S. soil in more than a decade. We're also talking about 1,000 employees from Veterans Affairs, 400 from Homeland Security, another 400 nearly from the EPA. Firings also took place at the National Animal Disease Labs. Employees known as the CDC's disease detectors were let go. Employees that handle food benefits and employees that handle bargaining contracts with teachers. We are also talking about 168 employees from the National Science Foundation, which is responsible in some way for nearly all the scientific and medical research in the country. And speaking of science, there were cuts to NASA, the National Weather Service, and the Nuclear Security Agency, which we will come back to here in a little bit. And those are just the ones that we know about, and not even all of them. There's also an undisclosed amount of firings at the Department of Defense, which on Tuesday, employees were just waiting around to see if they were on the chopping block. And I mean literally sitting and waiting because they knew that Elon Musk was physically on his way over to the Pentagon and was expected to make several thousand cuts. And like I said, that is just a small part of these firings and what will be future firings. Now, most, not all, but most of these employees were known as probationary employees. So employees still in their trial periods for their jobs, which actually minimizes what this was. These aren't like month-long or year-long things. Many of these jobs required these probationary periods to be years long. We are talking 2, 3, 5, sometimes years long, which is a lot longer than many private contracts, because often these jobs are things that require years of expertise to build up or a lot of time to just know if that person is the right fit for the job when it comes to things like doing research or in-the-field inspections or audits. Now, I need to say that a spokesperson for the Office of Personnel Management said the probationary period is a continuation of the job application process, not an entitlement for permanent employment. And going back to the FAA, the new expected incoming Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said that no air traffic controllers were impacted by this, but the Air Traffic Controllers Union said they were still looking into how the firings might actually impact air traffic control and, who keeps our flights safe. But several lawsuits have said that these firings are illegal because they're based on employment status, not on performance, which under lots of civil work agreements and also some federal laws, you're not allowed to fire people just because they're new. And we know that employees were fired based on their employment status because, one, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a real department, said that they were just firing probationary employees, but also they let go employees who had exemplary performance reviews as opposed to somebody who might have some sort of negative performance review, right? So again, not exactly the return to meritocracy that Trump promised here. And then there are other lawsuits that have been filed that have tried to stop Musk from firing their employees or reinstate fired employees, and they've been met with mixed success. The most recent one was from 14 states that were trying to block Musk from accessing government agencies that would lead to freezing federal funds or firing federal employees in those states that also help those states provide services. A judge just said yesterday, however, and not a judge who has been friendly to Trump in the past, said that the states didn't do a good enough job explaining how Musk's work would harm them, so she wasn't going to stop him in this particular instance, but did say if the states presented more evidence later on, things might change because that lawsuit is continuing. We also know that some of these firings weren't thought out because the administration is now trying to rehire some of these employees. Just this week, the USDA said it accidentally fired employees who were working on stopping the spread of bird flu. Oops, just a tiny little mistake, even though we killed 22 million chickens in just the last month alone, and it is spread to nearly twice as many dairy farms as poultry farms, just as we're getting a raw milk enthusiast to be in charge of all of the United States health programs, and real health experts, like my guest from a few weeks ago, Dr. Scott Greer, are saying things like this.
We've lost control of this. We've lost control partly because of things like the malfunctioning in the agricultural inspection system. Every time a flu infection happens in an animal, it has one more opportunity to mutate in a way that could be harmful to human beings. And right now, that virus, so to speak, has gone to a casino with an unlimited number of chips.
But, I'm sure we'll be able to get all those people back, and they won't at all be bitter as long as Elon, buys them a Starbucks gift card or something. Anyway, another instance of this happening, and the most widely reported one, is the several hundred national nuclear security employees who the administration is now trying to rehire because these people who were in charge of making sure that our nuclear stockpiles and weapons, didn't go off on their own, were fired. And surprise, surprise, they were the only ones who had been trained on how to do this work because, you don't want a lot of people knowing how that stuff works. And it turns out the Department of Energy and the U.S. government doesn't have a way to get a hold of them anymore after they were fired because their files had been deleted. And while that is funny in a I have to laugh, otherwise I'm going to scream sort of way, I have no doubt that we will be seeing a lot more of those kinds of stories and realizations within these agencies as the fallout from these firings continue. But what the really important parts of this fallout to know about are the things that are happening to employees who are both fired and the ones still working, and the communities that these firings are already affecting. So for those of you who are subscribers to the Make It Make Sense Substack, you got a whole article about some of this earlier this week, but federal employees have been begging for help through lawyers, in the press, and online primarily in a subreddit called r/Fed News. It's a forum where before federal employees would go to discuss sort of mundane things, complain about their government jobs the way that we all complain about our own bosses, but also to talk about things that the press just isn't covering because the federal government can be kind of boring. Well, hundreds of employees have taken to Fed News, and they've come together to find community, to commiserate, and to band together to fight back in certain cases. But it's the stories, for me, of the people who are dealing with these firings, and they are heartbreaking. One poster saying their firing was devastating, saying, "I'll have to sell my home. I live in a rural community with few economic options. I have no idea what I'll do." Another saying, "I had one employee and now that person is gone. I go to an office by myself and it's like a prison. Thank God for this subreddit or I would have absolutely zero support in this." And then another person who appears to have been fired from the U.S. Forestry Service ended their post about being worried not just for themselves, they said they might be okay, but for our natural resources, saying simply, "My heart is broken." And then there are the employees who are still working, who are understandably terrified of being let go because some tech bro with a God complex just feels like they need to go. People like this poster saying every email notification or call is like a gunshot to my nerves. Another wrote, "For the last several nights, I've been waking up every few hours convinced I've received an email from work and have had to check before I could go back to bed. It's nauseating. And then one from just last night from a person who said they were waiting to see if they will get fired next, and it was the not knowing when or how it would happen, of just being in a state of purgatory, not knowing if you'll literally have a job one day to the next. It's absolutely psychological warfare. And remember that phrase, because we will come back to it in this episode. Now, I know that when you hear about these cuts, it is easy to think that they don't affect you because you're not a government worker. Actually, I've got a good example. Here's comedian Tom Segura saying it on a Grifter Health podcast just about 9 days ago.
I cannot emotionally invest in Trump news and what's happening with this administration like I did the first time, because it just frankly takes up too much energy and too much time. It's also a distraction. It's not really affecting you the way you think it is. Mm-hmm. You start to hear these things and then you just bark at your friend about it. You're like, you just believe this. It's like, it's not really affecting most people in the way that they think it is and that they say it is. It just isn't. In the way that most presidents in there don't really change your life that much. Now, I know there's people that are going to hear this and be like, well, it kind of affected my life because X, Y, and Z happened. Okay, so there's things that are exceptions to that. But for the most part, like what the president is doing, whoever the president is, it doesn't really affect your life that much. You can choose to invest in such a way where the energy of your day went into reacting to what this person did that you either love or hate. And it's like, I can't do it.
Now, I know Segura is not a public official and doesn't answer to Elon Musk, but he does have millions of followers and listeners, way more than I do. But he's wrong. First, we are talking about people with lives and families, and to not feel something for that, to feel like you just can't pay attention to that, is wrong. I think we can all agree that it's wrong. And what people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are banking on us to do. Second, these cuts are already affecting people, real people. They are affecting cities and towns and communities across the country. We are talking nuclear power plants in Washington State, rural employee staffing agencies in Kansas. Staffers from various agencies told the Washington Post that programs meant to help people living in rural America physically pay their electric bills, not cover them, not pay them for them, but just get the money from where they live to the power company, was gutted, and could mean that those homes will not be able to keep their lights on. Another said that mental health access to veterans in small towns will struggle to survive, and another program in Wyoming that helped hikers navigate the woods, sold permits for Christmas trees, and provided firewood to the elderly had been forced to shut down. And if you're listening to those things and saying, well, I don't live in Wyoming, I don't live in rural America, I don't need these services, you do, actually, because it's not just those things. It is basic government services that will be impacted. All of us are going to be filing taxes here in just a few weeks, and the cuts to the Treasury Department will impact how long it takes to process our taxes and to get our refunds, and for the IRS to do its job of making sure that people are paying their taxes properly. And what that means is it will leave a lot of Americans and businesses in limbo while they try to figure out their finances with this IRS waiting time hanging over them. School districts will be impacted because jobs at the Department of Education will be cut that track things like special education for states and their funding, student financial aid, along with a lot of just data keeping, which means taxes in states and in our local towns and local governments will need to go up to cover those things. Police departments across the country depend on Department of Homeland Security to work properly, and these cuts will deprive first responders of grant money, of access to equipment, to crime data, and cross-jurisdiction communication, meaning, again, either taxes will need to be raised to cover the losses, or things will be a little more dangerous where you live. On top of that, we are talking Social Security checks that will be impacted for the 70-some million Americans who depend on them in some shape or form. The food we eat will be more dangerous, or we won't know about those dangers, or both, because inspectors of our food aren't there anymore. And the people who tell us about recalls aren't there either. And again, that is just the stuff that we know about right now. And you could expect, like I said, more stories like those to come out of this as we understand the nearly impossible scope of how losing these people will affect our daily lives. And now I think here most people would think, if these are the consequences, and we knew that they would happen, why do this? Why do it in this way? And I think that there are three answers for that. So first, and the shortest answer because it's a little disingenuous, is that Elon Musk and the Trump administration are really looking for fraud or waste in the government. The problem with that answer is they probably aren't, or at least the things that they have been showing us don't show that. And we know that because of the things and the people that they're targeting. Musk released on the official government website for the Department of Government Efficiency a quote-unquote wall of receipts of fraud and waste, which he said totaled $55 billion in savings for the American people, except for the math doesn't add up. When you look at the saved number that they calculate for you, it only adds up to about $18 billion in what they believe are savings on wasted money, but most of those things weren't fraud. They were approved spending by Congress, which means firing these employees isn't fraud because it was approved in the law. And we can argue about what is wasteful and what is not. That is the job of Congress to do that, but that's not what Musk is doing here. So the next two answers are the actual reasons for why the firings are being done this way, and they are equal parts easy to know, but also difficult to understand. One of the reasons is to privatize as much of the government as possible. This is actually a really old push from the Republican Party that often thinks that government can and should be run like a business. Think the opposition to the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, or the push to end public schools and put in place charter schools. In fact, a good phrase that captured a lot of this for decades was from a guy named Grover Norquist, who used to force Republicans to sign something that he called the Pledge, which was an agreement not to sign off on any new taxes when they were elected. So before they ever got into Congress and understood anything, the goal was to shrink the size of the government. And here is how he infamously explained it to NPR back in 2001.
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
So he seems nice, right? So Norquist's actual goal was to cut the government in half. And actually, that's exactly what Elon Musk has said he wants to do too. So not for nothing here, but this is another venture in which Musk has come in, stolen someone else's idea, claiming it to be his own. You can look at Tesla or PayPal or Twitter or SpaceX even and find those things. But then he repackages it all with more of that tech bro, STEM kid, off-putting energy. But the outcome of cutting the government in half will be needing to privatize a lot of those things the government used to do but now can't afford to do. And I know a lot of people out there are going to think, well, privatizing these things will inherently make them more efficient. And that's actually something that we've looked at for decades. And despite study after study, there's been no concrete evidence that privatizing things actually makes them any better. In fact, the UN Development Program, which helps nations that are poor or have undergone massive government changes, looked at decades of studies on whether public or private-run programs are more efficient and found, quote, no conclusive evidence that one model of ownership, public, private, or mixed, is intrinsically more efficient than the others. And that was no matter the definition of efficiency because they tried a few. This idea about privatization is more efficient is kind of just something that we have been told, because if fewer people believe in the public sector, more people will turn to the private sector, which means the people running those things in the private sector will get rich. So then it's pretty clear to see what Musk is doing to set himself up as a true, maybe dictatorial, maybe not, but a true leader in the U.S. And he's a follower of someone called Balaji Srinivasan, a cryptocurrency venture capitalist tech guy who wants to turn countries into what he calls startup nations, where countries are essentially entirely privatized, deal in only things like cryptocurrency as currency, and are made effectively streamlined by AI. But wrapped up in this, somebody still has to run these startups, and that will be the tech oligarchs like Musk or Srinivasan himself. And these are people who run their companies by threat and brutal tactics, at least in business standards. It's a worldview that a researcher from Harvard, Alison Stanger, who I'm cribbing a lot of this from, said in a recent article that could render irrelevant Congress's power over government spending and action and remove the power to hold presidents accountable from Congress, the judiciary, and American citizens. And boy, doesn't that sound like a lot of the things that we have been hearing lately. Now, if all of that sounds a little conspiratorial, I get it. It does sort of feel like I should be wearing a tinfoil hat, eating shelf-stable macaroni and cheese out of a bucket in a bunker. But if it's too far-fetched for you, that brings us to the last answer to why these firings are happening, and I can promise you it is going to make you feel worse. Remember that federal employee who was waiting to be fired and called the way Musk and his team were moving through these agencies as psychological warfare? Well, it turns out that they were devastatingly spot on. Because if these firings were about waste or fraud or privatizing for efficiency, those things could be done, but they would be much more targeted. It'd cause much less fear, and all the harms that we just talked about would not be there. But those things are the point, and we know that because the person behind a lot of this is a guy named Russell Vought, who was a primary author of Project 2025 and its specific plan to gut federal employee jobs, who said this back in 2023 to a private audience, but it was unearthed by the outlet ProPublica. And keep in mind, too, that Vought was just confirmed to be in charge of the Office of Government Management and the Budget.
We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. We want, when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down so that the EPA can't do all of the rules against our energy industry because they have no bandwidth financially to do so. We want to put them in trauma.
Then, as a newly minted member of the U.S. President's cabinet, telling another group of Americans that he wants to not just upend millions of American lives by radically downsizing the government, but to do it with gleeful malice. To do it by inflicting harm. In fact, it's not actually doing the job if he's not inflicting harm or causing terror within these agencies. Which means for the people behind these things and the people who support it, cruelty here is their aim. It's not about rooting out government waste. It's not really about making things more efficient. It's about causing harm. And not to say I told you so to those people who thought the privatizing everything was just a bridge too far. Doesn't this feel worse than that? I mean, it is worse than that, and also intrinsically true. Not just because we have the architect of it saying it on video, but because logically, given how these firings have happened, it's kind of the only answer that unfortunately makes the most sense. Okay, that is it for today's midweek episode, and I know that was not exactly a cheery end to this one today, but I do still think these things are important to know, even if they're hard. And I think they're important for other people to know too. And if you agree, please share this show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on, like and subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications on YouTube. It really helps share the show on that platform and several others. You can subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got bonus content up there, like that article about federal employees I talked about earlier. It's just $5 a month to subscribe, and it actually helps me keep this thing going. It helps me be able to afford to keep doing things like this. And if you don't want to do that, no sweat, but please share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Friday.